I'd like to present to you Calista Gorrell. This is her MArch thesis. We've been working with her all year. We're quite excited to certainly learn about her project. And I think I'll hand this over to you, Calista, and she's got some special instructions for us with a YouTube video link, as well as I think some Miro boards. And if at any point anyone has connectivity issues, I know I've had a lot lately, and you get kicked off, just feel free, obviously, to try to log back in, or I think there might also be certainly an ability to phone in. So anyhow, hand it over to Calista. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Whitney. So hi, everyone. I'm Calista. I am a two-year MArch grad. I originally came from the University of Kansas, where I did my undergraduate, and I've been completing my master's in architecture at UW-Milwaukee, and also working towards, with the thesis being kind of the wrapping up of this, a concentration in historic preservation. So did you all receive the link to the Miro board? Wonderful.
Yes.
So if you navigate to that, I have embedded in kind of like the top left corner a YouTube video that I believe you'll just be able to play from directly within the Miro board. So I'll just I'll have you go ahead and start playing that in a moment.
Calista, just so you know, I just posted the link there because other faculty and students who are joining in, if they want to be able to see your Miro board, I just wanted to make that accessible. So.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, so recorded is my thesis presentation of the Future Preservation Collection, which is a handbook to lowercase historic preservation. So at this point, I will have you start watching that, and then we'll come back to the Zoom meeting when you are finished.
Calista, thank you for your introduction. I just want to confirm that this is a 26-minute video.
Yes, it is. So my work has been centered around a handbook, which is this right here. I wanted to play to the kind of the time we're in with storytelling being very, I think, like rampant along the internet as we're all at home. So the presentation on YouTube is sort of a flip through of this handbook as a narration by myself. So
okay,
that,
and you're expecting that we watch the whole video, right?
Yes, and then we'll join back for a conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you, Calista.
Hi everyone, this is Calista. Thank you so much for tuning in to my thesis presentation of the Future Preservation Collection, a handbook to lowercase historic preservation. And this is our handbook in my hands. Yeah, there we have it. We're gonna go ahead and get started. In addition to being Calista, I am also your tour guide, here to take you through this introductory handbook of lowercase historic preservation of older industrial buildings near you. Although this study is based in the city of Milwaukee, it's important to acknowledge that lowercase historic preservation is applicable across the United States, and this is only the beginning. You may be familiar with the traditional capitalized institution of historic preservation, residing within the National Park Service and responsible for the nomination and guided preservation of historic buildings in the states. Branching out from historic preservation, which by nature is conservative in its applications and selection, lowercase historic preservation is the opposite. Liberal in its selections and application, lowercase hp takes into account a multitude of normally silenced perspectives, so it is not limited to the preservationist's view of the building as an object. It acknowledges the present, as well as the past, as historical in nature. Lowercase hp investigates and sees the value in buildings and communities not typically deemed worthy of capital HP and blend into our daily lives. Let's stop letting the institutions favor a limited human experience when selecting buildings to preserve and reuse, and give more buildings and people a chance to thrive. We'll start with some background knowledge and then get into a few specific examples of lowercase historic preservation in action. This is everything that can be found in the book. We're going to have a brief overview of some of the context, spend some time on the interventions, and continue with our call to continuance. Part A, context, is where we begin. So let's take a stroll and center ourselves in the Midwestern Rust Belt city of Milwaukee. What is its relationship between historic preservation and the city look like, and how might that change? We'll see the current capital HP criteria and standards of how to choose and intervene in historic buildings, their success, faults, and how that might influence our transition to lowercase historic preservation. So we're inserting the name of any Midwest industrial city here, but specifically Milwaukee. Sitting off the coast of Lake Michigan, north of Chicago, the birthplace of many American industries, has a history distinguishable from that of other Midwestern counterparts, in most ways, but not in its relationship to capital HP. Many middle-of-the-map cities in America have a serious amount of building stock dating back to the Industrial Revolution that, in not-so-recent trends, have become the hosts for rehabilitation and reuse into, but not limited to, condos, apartments, office spaces, retail, multi-use facilities. One way Milwaukee is similar to places like Kansas City and St. Louis is the jarring tangible and intangible dividing lines that separate the city into parts by race, left over from redlining and never fully remedied. As cities progressed, so did the governmental segregation of people by racial geographic profiling, leaving industries of commerce, prospects of healthcare, and opportunities for growth by the wayside. Lack of investment and economic stimulation in these neighborhoods leads to the neglect and abandonment of buildings. Often, with generations and families staying together in these parts of town by choice or by institutional frameworks that make it seemingly impossible to otherwise, the sense of community can be found here to be insurmountable. One such neighborhood is Milwaukee's North Side. This neighborhood stretches far and wide to the north and west of Milwaukee proper, and also retains a majority of the city's African American population. Many families would have begun living in these areas near where they would have worked in factories, so these buildings are still sprinkled throughout their residential homes today. In some parts of Milwaukee, these places have been quick to be snapped up by developers and gentrified by the arrival of its new tenants. But this operation has been progressing slowly across Milwaukee's north side. What's been continuing to happen on the north side is perpetuated by many social, cultural, and institutional entities that you cannot pin it to a single cause. Old industrial buildings here get coined as properties that may yield significance in the future by institutions that guide in the reuse and assigning of worth to old and historic building stock. So what of them? They sit unused, ignored, taken for granted in places that have been pushed aside for far too long. What shall we do, you ask? And why should we care, you ask? Well, how dare you, I say. Our Midwestern cities, we really love them, but sometimes they can be slow to change and adapt. Historic preservation thrives in places with rich histories that are willing and able to comply with these rules and criteria. But many historic buildings, in Milwaukee in particular, exist in their new preserved life as a means of commodification. with a rise in urban renewal, including capital historic preservation and adaptive reuse projects. These places can serve as a beacon of heritage in the ever-evolving city. The social and economic restructuring caused by urban renewal has a distinct class dimension that can displace and marginalize underprivileged people. These are the four criteria that would determine if a building is worthy of capitalized historic preservation. They are from the National Park Service and centered around what is considered generally to be the best of the highest order and from dominant society's viewpoint. However, well that these criteria do at weeding out everything but the cream of the crop, they can be discriminatory to buildings that make up the larger patchwork of our society. Do they not deserve our attention as well? What happens when the buildings we actually live with? What happens to the buildings we actually live with when we do not value them highly? And of course, any criteria are made with the purpose of excluding something else. But when will the outliers be good enough? And when will we be good enough? So I have 4 criteria amended for determining if a building is worthy of lowercase historic preservation. And they are as follows: that the property is associated with current events that are playing a part in the ever-evolving pattern of our history, or that the property is associated with the life or lives of people who live with it, or that people who live with it identify and associate themselves with it, or C, the property embodies distinctive characteristics that suggest the passage of time and usage in its type, construction, and materials, or in their wear, or that the property has the ability to yield information of the present or the future. So these are the 4 criteria that would determine if a building is worthy of lowercase historic preservation, and they differ from those of capital historic preservation in that the qualities that make them worthy are associated with the present time, people, and non-monetary intangible qualities. It's about the preservation of what is most important to people today, and as years pass, what is most important to those people. The lowercase historic preservation should read as a chronicle of our movement in time, physically and psychologically. Worth and treatments will change in the context of time, contrary to a standard set of preservation guidelines that is about the physical and the best ways to keep that intact historically. To define preservation in its lowercase is about the decapitalization, quite literally. Using lowercase historic preservation criteria allows for the consideration of old buildings that affect our daily lives and advocates for their own well-being that is tied to ours. Historic is of the past, but also of the present, and it is important to be able to perceive the present as historical in order to imagine the future. Given that, the qualities of a building that define historic are more easily applied to the contemporary and evolving times, giving people the opportunity to choose what is important to them. There are 8 standards from capital historic preservation that are how you would kindly treat a building that would be deemed worthy by the criteria, how you would treat them. And as a whole, they're trying their best, but they could have more respect for the present. Instead of a building reused as it would have historically, or for a new purpose that exclusively maximizes its features, spaces, and spatial relationships, it would be more relevant to not only think of the building as an object meant for the best utilitarian use, but to take into account what may be best for the life of the building and its surrounding people. Might that be just as important? Instead of the historic character of a building being precisely preserved, what would it mean to do with that respect to what is of historic of the building today? Perhaps some elements relevant then and now would surface, but it would give a chance for others not historically seen, These standards mean well, but to become a version that transitions from their use for the commodification of historic buildings to a version that becomes useful for our present and future, we move to here. Here we have lowercase historic preservation intervention, category, and strategy. So let's say to get to a place where changes to a larger system would take place, one may have to start small at the scale of an intervention. So the following guidelines for intervening in lowercase historic preservation buildings are motivated by a calling to attention of the interior and exterior while promoting new interaction that eventually results in a new use of the building, serving and relevant to the immediate surrounding. Lowercase HP interventions are tasked with exposing elements of these buildings commonly overlooked by a capital HP and are promoting further inspection and use. They manifest in 3 theoretical and physical forms that promote interaction in the building's unused state and would also support new use of the building. These interventions are a cut, a curtain, and a cast. A cut to a lowercase HP building serves as a portal into the secret interior life of the building and exposes the malleable nature of these old forgotten sites. It would cause people to see the tangible and intangible fractures around them at a larger scale. This also contradicts in principle to capital HP by taking away building fabric, but this, in addition to the prior, calls attention to the site and message for mending. With the goal of not only mending the cut, but the site as a whole, the cut will have begun to heal the building and community it graced. A few guidelines for the cut are that it will either be expanded upon from an existing significant architectural element and be connected to or respond adjacently, will be no less than 3.5 feet wide and adjust to architectural elements to allow for future use as a portal to enter or another purpose, will have a depth and height enough for a person to inhabit it or more, will maintain the structural integrity of the building, and will only take away existing building fabric, only adding if necessary for the structural integrity, in kind with the existing. Lowercase HP intervention guidelines for a curtain aim to cover historic fabric, revealing other traits of the building and site not noticed when viewed in full. Taking place on a large scale, the unusual curtain draws attention to the overlooked buildings and guides movement of people around the site. The obstruction of the building's defining physical features is not something one would find in capital historic preservation, but is crucial in lowercase historic preservation's notion of meaning of historic not meaning the past, but also the present, with the goal of bringing to the forefront that which the curtain hides. A few of these guidelines for a curtain would be that it will occupy no less than 2 facades of the building and could but does not have to be continuous. It will not always be at a height that a pedestrian could reach, but always partially visible. It will guide pedestrians' eyes and feet to notable features around the building and to paths around it. It will be printed upon with the walls of the interior and has the ability to move and degrade over time. It will not interfere with the structural integrity of the building. And our last intervention guideline is a cast. So a cast on a lowercase historic preservation building conveys the impression of the interior spaces on the outside, announcing itself, displaying unevenness, cracks, and saying that that's okay. It reflects the community surrounding the building, reaching out with a gesture of acceptance and use. A cast in a capital HP typically serves as a form of documentation or a tool for replication, contributing to something other than itself. The lowercase historic preservation cast reaches its goal when it exposes the interior, not only as the interior, but as a reflection of time and human use. And a few of these guidelines would be that it would either be directly expanded upon from an existing significant architectural element and be connected to or respond adjacently. It will only add to the existing building fabric in kind. It will provide a function to the pedestrians such as cover or seating. It will maintain structural integrity of the building, and it will be made of a material that has the ability to be imprinted with the walls of the interior, such as, but not limited to, concrete, plaster, rubber. And now we have arrived at part B of interventions for lowercase HP. At this point, you might be wondering how the lowercase historic preservation criteria and guidelines for intervening may come into fruition in some of our older great Milwaukee building stock, specifically, like mentioned before, in the north side. Ahead, we're going to see 3 lowercase historic preservation buildings, how they qualify, and what it means what it looks like to intervene in them with the 3 operations. Location 1 is located at 3210 North Pierce in North Milwaukee, and is worthy of lowercase historic preservation under criteria C, that it embodies distinctive characteristics that suggest the passage of time and usage in its type, construction, and materials, and in their wear. This building and all of the other buildings featured in this book were listed in a survey of Milwaukee's industrial building stock with the aim of identifying potential capital historic preservation sites for preservation, but from it came a category of buildings that were classified as properties that may yield significance later. Our friend here fell in that latter. At each location, I am going to call out one of the intervention strategies, and here we have the cast. So the cast in this location is located on the north and northwest side of the existing building, taking form and expanding from the sills of 2 old existing wooden framed windows on the side of a garage extremity. Why here instead of any other place on the building? This narrow, non-major side of the building is the first one people encounter when crossing the street to follow the beer line trail behind the building. With an inviting seat here, the pedestrian has the chance to investigate the cast, interacting with it directly, taking a closer look at the building as they continue their walk. The cut here takes place on one of the non-major facades of the building, inhabiting an existing extremity of the building, currently hosting the cut. The people may enter and be granted with a glimpse of the inside from this tall portion. The curtain in this building occurs at intervals coinciding with the outwardly expressed structural piers, and occurs on the south and west facades as the 2 streets join pedestrians from the neighborhood as well as the beer line. Next up on our lowercase HP buildings is 1408 North 5th Street, and is a lowercase historic preservation building most strongly identifying under criteria B, a property that is associated with the life or lives of people who live with it, or that the people who live with it identify and associate themselves with it. So this building was home to a non-major beverage company and housed its bottling operations. And it was bought just 1 year ago for a huge amount more than the value of the estimate. And so someone else has seen the potential in this location and has been picked as a property that may yield significance in the future, but it already seems significance by its existence. Emphasized here in this location is the cut. The cut is located on the west facade of the building and makes its home in the place of one of the existing single-pane windows. This narrow cut is using an existing opening to avoid damaging masonry structure, but does make a move of extending down through the base. So why here as opposed to anywhere else on the building? It takes place in the midst of the row of single-pane windows interrupting the rhythm but also maintaining it, pulling pedestrians towards the center of the facade where they can experience the most from the interior of the cut. The cast in this location follows vertical structural bays expressed on the exterior, breaking up the windows on the main south facade, and extends down to provide seating for pedestrians. The curtain in this location occupies two facades of the west and the south, and taking place here on these two key walkways connects neighborhoods to the north and industrial buildings along the other axis. The third and final location we'll be looking at is 1748 North 13th Street, that most strongly identifies with the lowercase preservation criteria that it is associated with current events that are playing a part in the evolving pattern of our history. This building was bought for nearly $20,000 less than the value estimate, and it's clear that the property in this area resides and is undervalued due to its residence and history that is perpetuated by the fact that investment into the community is withheld by the same institution that is underlyingly causing the devaluation. Identified as a property that may yield significance in the future, it already has significance and value that it needs to open up and be useful for its community. The curtain in this location is located on the upper half of the south and west facades of the building. Secured from the roof and draping down, it flows independently of the facade. And then why here instead of anywhere else on this building? The narrow west facade, being the most articulated of the structure, is strongly butted up to the completely blank south facade, masking the building's key architectural features and detailing on the top banding, in addition to masking the blank facade, levels the playing field of importance between these two sides and prompts the question of value. The cut in this location is located on the east facade at the back of the building, utilizing one of the arched windows from the second floor and expanding down to encompass a previous back door entry. The cast in this location is located on both the main south and the minor east facade, extending from banding between two sets of windows and providing a shelter, interest, and stopping point. We've reached our call for continuance. Just finished looking at a very small sampling of lowercase historic preservation buildings and interventions. Now that attention has been called, we must continue the work. What can you do to push for lowercase historic preservation in the fight for taking care of our unused and undervalued old building stock while advocating for the respectful and relevant raising up of our neighborhoods and cities equally? So here, as a call to action, lowercase historic preservation is about the past and the future through our present. Using lowercase historic preservation allows for the consideration of old buildings that affect our lives daily and advocates for their well-being that is tied to our own. Historic is of the past, but also of the present. It is important to be able to perceive the present as historical in order to imagine a future. Milwaukee, other Midwestern cities across the United States, have had a struggle between commodity-driven historic preservation, developer-driven reuse of buildings that have been deemed valuable enough to do so, and then this other outer ring of buildings that don't quite fall into either category and get left behind. Some may be in plain sight and others hidden, but that's their beauty, of being ingrained into our daily lives. We can begin to identify these locations from completed building stock surveys like Milwaukee's Industrial Building Survey, where these buildings featured in the handbook were listed as may yield significance in the future, to investigating buildings you find in your own neighborhoods. You may use the criteria of lowercase historic preservation to put name to the value of your found building. Through collaboration, you can carry out standards and guidelines of intervening in lowercase HP buildings to start envisioning and executing a cut, a curtain, or a cast. To do this is to spark change and challenge the status quo of what most people would see the building as at surface level. The inside-out exposure of interiors perhaps never before seen by the people who live with these buildings daily prompts further inspection and introspection. This calls for a new use of the building as the intricacies of the location surface, and people see it as more than the abandoned building on the corner. To have agency over preservation of the places we live in and the time we live in is how we elevate our communities and continue to grow as a whole. So take this with you and start thinking of how lowercase historic preservation can make an impact wherever you are. We have an appendix of resources, and that is our handbook. Thank you very much for listening.
Probably everybody is just finishing up watching Calista's pre-recorded presentation, and I guess if anyone is still needing a moment or two, if you would just want to indicate that in the chat or something. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Calista to sort of steer us from this point forward. And I think I just wanted to prompt Calista, kind of to what degree you want us to be navigating within the boards on Miro versus not is entirely your design here. So feel free to initiate the conversation and feedback with your critics as so desired.
Sure. So yeah, now that you've all seen the handbook, all of the spreads are laid out as you probably saw in the Miro board. So I guess I'll just open it up to your first kind of general comments or questions, and then we can go from there. Ariela.
Just 2 points of clarification while I try to figure out how to lower my hand. Sorry, we're still in France. We're having some debates about Zoom and other tools. 2 points of clarification, just to confirm what you just said, which is that the Miro boards are the exact same thing as what we saw in the video, which is the exact same thing as what I downloaded and looked at earlier today. Okay.
Yes.
And the second thing, and this is, I don't know who this is addressed to because obviously I'm coming in from another school. I teach at the French architecture school system is all public with the exception of one school. And I teach at the École nationale supérieure de Paris-Malaquais, which is located on the site of the École de Beaux-Arts in Paris. So historic preservation capital and lowercase both are everyday issues here in France, even during confinement, when there were lots of debates about what to do about projects that were underway and the conservation of heritage. But so I want to understand just quickly what is the context of a thesis in a concentration in historic preservation, if somebody could give me the 1 or 2 line answer, because these are obviously proposals for strategies that are shown as a demonstration in on particular sites, but it isn't a single realized architectural project. So just a point of clarification. Is somebody, either Calista or your instructors, whoever wants to answer that, is it a choice of the student?
I can intervene in here, Ariela, as Calista's chair. So obviously, in terms of the thesis, she's decided rather than, let's say, proposing a design intervention into one specific site, it's really about, let's say, writing this lowercase hp as a methodology, as a handbook, a guide for future application, sort of directly in dialogue with, let's say, the rhetoric of historic preservation in terms of what one can and can't do, and finding room to operate in terms of alternative strategies. And then, of course, I think one of the struggles that one always encounters in something like a thesis, if it's not about intervening, if it's not about a building or any one specific intervention. In this case, we felt that it was important for Calista to demonstrate how this handbook could operate as a form of generative design by showing some specific possibilities of application towards specific sites. And of course, I think that in and of itself could certainly be an area of conversation about the pros and cons of doing that. And then just to clarify, as she has elected herself to do, earn a certificate in historic preservation, interestingly enough, none of her committee members are, let's say, specialists in historic preservation, but perhaps we have all dabbled in it, whether that's theoretically and or professionally. So really Calista is the designer of her thesis inside and out in terms of its concept and to what degree it does or doesn't negotiate historic preservation.
Okay, so that's really, I guess that last comment gets to my question really, which is to understand that you are, Calista, fully the designer of this whole approach and the choice to project your theoretical argument, to take the question of historic preservation as a theoretical question and to engage in this theorized and demonstration strategy to sort of display your growing expertise.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for those answers. I'll let other people react and then I may have some comments.
I can jump in. Thanks, Calista. It's, I think, a really interesting thesis. A question that immediately comes to mind is, did you consider the possibility that through your your amendments to the capital HP and in the enactment of these the cut curtain cast strategies, what happens if through the enactment of those strategies that the building, say those examples that you provided, what happens if those buildings are somehow elevated to capital HP qualification standards and are then eligible for that kind of certification? What would your response to that?
Oh man, yeah, I think that if that were the case, it would definitely take a lot of time. Just as if these just so happen to be in place and at a specific location, and I think I don't know if it would truly happen that way. I think it would definitely elevate them to a degree. But I think the whole framework of the lowercase is to elevate the buildings no matter what, and to promote a new use independent of the capitalized historic preservation. But yeah, that's a really interesting thought.
I mean, I ask because I wonder, are you advocating for the eradication of capital HP, or simply an amendment to it, or that we create two very distinct, non-conflating categories of preservation?
I am not advocating for the complete annihilation of capital HP, as there, are definitely key buildings that have been vital to the shaping of urban fabric, the United States, beyond that, that do deserve to have that sort of status and care taken. But lower HP is really just responding to the exclusion that it causes, and like forming this kind of like a parallel adjacent, and in a way to operate that doesn't just fall under capital historic preservation or developer-driven reuse. So yeah.
I have a question that I'd love to have some clarifications. Are the buildings that you're imagining kind of taking these interventions on, are these abandoned buildings, or are they occupied or currently used in some way?
Yeah, they, so I think I mentioned in the recording, they were, in my studies, I found them on a survey of industrial building stock throughout Milwaukee, whose goal was to identify all of the industrial buildings in Milwaukee, find the ones that were worthy of capital historic preservation, and then from that, there was the list of the ones that might yield significance in the future, and that's where all of those buildings would fall into a certain geographic location, separate from the capital HP buildings. And they, at the time of that survey, which was done in 2010, all of those buildings were abandoned. And then further research has proven that the buildings they're owned by someone. They've all been bought since the survey. So the survey did some sort of raising of these buildings already, without giving them like a full, like still kind of not quite worthy of like a full preservation tactic. But none of them are inhabited at the moment. They are all still unused. So that's kind of where I saw this starting, was in locations like that. And so that's how those were kind of chosen.
So if I understand it correctly, it's kind of a way to draw attention to these buildings that are maybe abandoned at the time. And it's interesting that your precedents are mainly artists like Gordon Matta Clark and Jean-Claude and Rachel White-Reed. And these have a sort of, some of them have a sort of, they have a shorter lifespan, like they're meant to be sort of a temporary intervention. How do you kind of, do you imagine these interventions of yours kind of having a sort of lifespan? Are they just to kind of get attention to the building and someone to kind of take over the building and occupy it? Is it, I guess I'd love to hear kind of more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So like the precedents, the cut, curtain, and cast also have a certain lifespan, but their end goals are to promote the new use of a building that's relevant to its context, and not kind of latching itself on to really common like developer-driven adaptive reuse and historic preservation. And the all of the interventions in some form or another, once the building is in a new use, would translate into that new use. So they wouldn't be completely forgotten, but they would not operate in the same way anymore. So like the cut could, like one of the guidelines was to have it a certain dimension and adjusting to architectural elements in a way that it could be used in the future for another point of entry to the building, given whatever new use it may have, or some sort of smaller space that the new use would indicate. And then like the cast could be, because it's all about this kind of inside out strategy of exposing what's not able to be seen. And so the cast brings that out, but with the new use, it might wind up back in the building as like casting in capital HP is like really just a form of documenting reproduction, serving as a like a documentation of a certain item or time. And so this cast would be able to do the same thing with a new use. It would be sort of disjointed from its current position in the lower HP and brought in and be able to serve as a testament to what was. And then the curtain is obviously the most ephemeral. It was also the most difficult to kind of figure this one out. But its goal, it obviously would not be able to like fully stay or be translated into something else like architecturally, because it would degrade, it would do all sorts of things. But it would, like the purpose of it is to like promote this kind of new way of seeing the architectural elements that are not on full view when you're actually looking at the entire building. So masking is revealing these new elements as well as guiding people around the site. And so one way that a curtain could manifest with the new use of a building is, and it would be different for every site, would be sort of like markers or pathways that would still kind of facilitate a new circulation about the site in a way that was not before. So yeah, that's kind of how I see their lifespan is short to prompt the interest and investigation, and kind of see how they were like worthy of doing this and then translating it into a future use.
Calista, because we have about 5 minutes left, I just wanted to give Alex Timmer an opportunity to make some comments, and then of course any of our other critics or your committee members that want to offer their input.
So I just want to make just a quick comment, because I think, and I'll attempt to connect some thoughts that seem to be running through this. My initial reaction to it was, you know, was to try and parse out like the function of each of these interventions outside of the way that you've sort of framed them, which I would agree is sort of, I think it was Danielle had mentioned, they're all art references, but you're proposing them as like functional interventions. And so what's interesting with, for example, the curtain, well, that technique is actually used in Europe extensively to cover buildings while they're doing the historic preservation work, right? So there's already an existing use for that type of technique. And I'm wondering, okay, well, maybe we need to give that curtain more of an active role that actually then leverages its temporality, rather than sort of treating it as, in terms of a sort of hierarchy, treating it as equal as, say, casting a concrete seat.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of the cut and the cast, which are much more permanent, and they propose to react much more specifically to the geometries of the building. The cut to me seems like that is the most, you know, like a new opening, a new sort of allowing a different, it could completely change the function of the building. So that to me seems the most compelling, both in the way that it's reacting to existing geometry. It has to acknowledge the structure. You know, you're not just punching into anything. You have to actually find an old opening, open it in certain ways. But then with the cast, then, and I had to reread through the rules for the cast, and I'm wondering, I'm looking at the sort of really long bench. It seems like it's less tied into the building, and so I think you know, in all of this conversation, there's a sort of issue of temporariness, permanence, and function, and how do we start to reorganize these elements, the curtain, the cast, and the cut, to maybe get them not to be treated so equally, but maybe they actually, one leads to another, for example. So you're actually, like, I could walk through the city and find a building that someone used your technique because, oh, I see, you know, there's the curtain, and then maybe the bench is more integrated into the way that you're cutting the opening. But to me, I think the biggest thing that the project needs is maybe a little bit more work on the sort of functional role of each of these things to push them, and I think to address what I think is a lack of hierarchy in how they're applied.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, in what relationship they have to one another, right, Alex? I think that's kind of what you're getting at. Like, how do they kind of work as a team as opposed to three sort of distinct options that one has to kind of go choosing through, but how can they be used kind of in tandem?
Right, or like iterations of each other,
right?
In a way, as well, or what iterations? It's clear at the same time that these are a set of, what's key, we understand, I think, is that there's a set of rules that are, and again, that these are just demonstrations, but maybe, I think what we're hearing is that people are asking for the demonstrations to push further into really what is essentially part of your key critical argument about value. And this sort of, I find, just to go maybe to make one comment about the writing and the theoretical argument, that's a little bit maybe aside to the side of the demonstration part, is that I really appreciate this kind of curious choice to use lowercase hp as a form of a kind of social and political critique of value as it's applied to working, to engaging in the city, engaging in architecture, and engaging in communities. So that's a very interesting approach. It's perhaps not by accident that Jorge Otero Payos appears here with the whole context of the work done in the journal Future Anterior. And I guess there are two quick comments. One is, I think they're related in a way that I almost wish that in the writing and in this performative demonstration of the text, which is really a big part of your thesis, that on the one hand, perhaps more of the theoretical depth, that you would demonstrate what we know is behind your argument, which is a lot of reading into, I could think of a whole series of families of figures and names that you could cite beyond the physical examples that you use, beyond the examples that you use for your demonstrations, which are Jorge and then a series of artists. Jorge here wearing his artist hat. So that it would be nice if you continue to work on this, perhaps in future studies, to densify and to demonstrate, to show, to reveal that depth of research. And I could think of, you know, anything from the way Aldo Rossi thinks about history and memory to Future Anterior. The other thing I would say is that the same might go for the way that you represent your case studies, which I understand the very muted kind of single palette, single color, dual tone printing. But since you're really talking so much about matter and how important that is for giving meaning, and how much of this depends on you looking very carefully at what's important about existing. The French call it l'existant when they don't want to call it heritage, which would be the big HP. They call it existing architecture, pre-existing architecture. Since that's so important to your whole argument about social and political value, perhaps it would be interesting to demonstrate, to show that in the real in a slightly more intense manifestation of the materiality of the projects that you're working on. I don't know if that, if I'm speaking French or English at this point.
Yeah.
Whatever. You understand what I mean? Like, show the materiality of the work.
30 seconds, and thanks, Calista. Congratulations.
Thank you, everyone, for your feedback.
Thank you, everyone, for your very thoughtful feedback. And I do agree. I think this is definitely the beginning of a much larger project, or has the potential to be. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation, Calista, and congratulations once again.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Calista, take a look at the World Monuments Fund.
Okay, I will do that.